A topic that not everybody has entirely addressed is the reality that the countries that are foremost in advancing this proposal with the UN have their own major crises with Islamic terrorism, with not just Islamic terrorism, because that is something that occasionally can be born, but radicalized Islamic populations within their own countries. So the UK, France have a severe crisis in that regard. Canada and Australia have their own crises that have gotten less headlines. And to a large extent, these countries continue to follow the notion, the completely fallacious notion, that if they are able to conduct this giveaway, they're able to prop up an Islamic State within Israel, they won't have to worry about their own Palestinian state, their own Islamic state forming and engaging in violence in their own countries because they are not under any illusions about the violent intensity of Islamic nationalism. They just publicly refuse to acknowledge it or address it or deal with it in any meaningful way. And this has really been the entire argument for a Palestinian state from early on, which was best conducted with international terrorism. Give these people their own country, or they're going to hijack your planes, they're going to set off bombs, they're going to conduct violence across the region and across the world. They're going to take the world hostage. And this was originally a Soviet plan that was carried out for obvious reasons because the larger goal was to cause chaos and to fracture the so-called relationship between the West and the Muslim world. That relationship, of course, was largely one way, and we see that more clearly than ever today. As people on this call have ably described, China has stepped into that position, but China is less interested in chaos than the Soviet Union was. The Soviet Union simply wanted to fracture the bonds of Western societies. Communist China, on the other hand, wants to preserve trade relationships because those are very vital to it. They're how China builds influence and finances its operations. But at the same time, it wants to undermine American allies to whatever extent it can and wants to undermine the Western world order. And this was a very useful means of doing so. What Russia, what China, what other players have tried to do is, first of all, sow division within the West. And Israel has been a very useful means of doing that because it divides Western countries. It plays in the divisions between the left and the right. So it's already a net plus for China, for other American enemies of the United States to do that. And of course, if China is able to fracture and weaken Israel, it is closer to building a hegemony in the Middle East that will not be American or Western influenced, which of course is something that it wants very much, but it would like to do that with a minimum of disruption to trade networks and doing that through the UN, doing it the way that some of the Europeans have proposed with a UN force, again, very helpfully divides the West. Just locally among citizens who are going to have this debate between supporting a terrorist state or opposing it, and also dividing the various countries of the West against each other. So it's very ideal for China's purposes. Now, beyond all that, the actual Western countries that are going along with this remain terrified of an Islamic threat, one that they have no actual answer to. We've had the war on terror, which was motivated by this idea that if we bring democracy to the fore, we're going to have better leadership in the Muslim world. We're going to repair this pattern of violence. And of course, that failed badly, as did Obama's new Middle East, which was motivated by the same idea, except that it was, if you bring these Islamist systems to power, they're not going to want to engage in global terrorism anymore. And now they're defaulting back to the same old idea, which is somehow if you take Israel out of the equation, if you take the so-called Palestinian conflict out of the equation, we're going to have global peace. And that is, of course, entirely delusional. It's snake oil. And there are some people like Macron, I'm pretty sure, know that it's snake oil. Others are willing to be convinced by it because they're unwilling to face the real threat, which is the threat of Islam. It's the threat, obviously, of enemies like China. And those threats are too expensive to face because those threats have deep hooks, deep roots now within Western societies. Actually decoupling from China, actually standing up to China has a very high price. Decoupling, trying to stand up to the Muslim world has a very high price as well, especially as Muslim populations continue to increase in Western countries. On the other hand, selling out Israel has a very low price. All you have to do is jettison the Jewish population, some of the more Christian population, and you suddenly have a great formula. It's a very cheap price. And while it doesn't actually solve anything, it creates the illusion of potentially having solved something, which is why they're all enthusiastic about voting for this at the UN. But there's actually very little interest in doing anything meaningful on the ground. None of these countries are actually serious about sending forces to invade Israel if they're actually faced with the prospect of Israel shooting back. However, when it comes to performative actions, then they're very enthusiastic about doing this because a big part of this is about pacifying their domestic Muslim populations. The problem is that these domestic Muslim populations are unpacifiable, and they're unpacifiable worldwide, which is why the response to the UK Prime Minister Starmer's recognition of the so-called Palestinian state was for the PLO to start talking about reparations, because it's very much a strong horse, weak horse formula, unless if you show weakness, what you're actually going to get is more chaos, more violence, more pressure, more intimidation. The impulse then is to push and get as much as possible out of these countries that are choosing to recognize a terrorist state. And the same thing is going to happen to them domestically. By recognizing terrorism, by recognizing the effectiveness, the efficacy of October 7th abroad, they're guaranteeing that they're going to have an October 7th eventually at home. They're guaranteeing that they're going to be more violence and terrorism at home, which is exactly the opposite of what they have in mind. So rather than actually successfully trading Israel for peace with their Muslim populations, what they're actually doing is they're trading Israel for terrorism and eventually their own version of October 7th. The narrative that this is a larger conflict within Islam, with Western civilization, and not just with Western civilization, but a point I've made over and over again is that Muslims are currently at war with Jews, with Christians, with Hindus, with Buddhists. If you name a religion that has anybody is at all aware of, there's good odds that Muslims are persecuting that religion, at war with it, in conflict with it. So this is very much a global religious war rather than the Sudetenland gimmick where they take some of the Volksdeutsche that were left behind in Israeli territory after the wars and pretend that they're an oppressed minority. So we definitely need to push back against that. We need to absolutely demonstrate that, yes, Tamar Marcus's work is really vital for showing that there is absolutely no peace partner on the other side, that the other side wants nothing but conflict. We also need to deal with the hypocrisy and the double dealing of these people who claim to advocate politically, culturally for the so-called state. They're not doing this for their stated reasons. None of them are doing this for their stated reasons. They're doing it for entirely other reasons, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's cowardice about their own internal conflicts, whether it's wishful thinking, whether it's the need to solve some sort of paradigm, whether it's resentment of Israel. But they're not doing this for the stated reasons. There are very few people who are at all involved in any of this, who have any awareness of this, and then come away thinking that a Palestinian state is a viable solution. So rather than playing defense, which we unfortunately do quite a bit in explaining why this state is a very bad idea and why Israel really does not deserve to be slandered in this way, a lot of which, frankly, is goes into our own very own echo chamber. We need to make the case aggressively. Why? First of all, creating such a terrorist state is going to destabilize the region. It's going to destabilize the world. That's something we haven't really sufficiently talked about, but there's certainly plenty of history behind this idea. We've seen the damage that Hezbollah did in its dominance of Lebanon. We've seen the damage that the so-called Palestinians, the PLO, did when it was able to cause that kind of damage in Jordan and Lebanon. So creating a state will, first of all, destabilize the region. It will also destabilize the world. We've seen the outburst of violence in the United States and parts of the West over, against Israel, but also against these governments. And if these governments think that the violence is going to die down, that it's going to go away, they are very, very sadly mistaken. If anything, the violence will upsurge, it will get worse. And that is really what creating the state would do. It will create the instability, it will create violence across the region and around the world. And those people who support it have to be asked why they support creating violence and instability in the region and around the world.